And to kick things off by introducing our first speakers, Catherine Hills and Sam Lucy from Cambridge University, who will talk on the chronology of the cemetery at Spong Hill, North Elmham, Norfolk. Sam and Catherine.
I'm going to start. This is going to be a kind of a sandwich lecture, so I shall talk for about 10 minutes, and then Sam will firmly march up and dislodge me if I haven't shut up. And then I'll come back for a few minutes at the end to give some conclusions. So I'm going to give you some introductory stuff, and Sam will then explain what we've done during the current project, and I shall come up, as I said, with a few conclusions and even highlighting this methodological issue to be discussed later on. Right, and I should first of all apologise, particularly to those of you in the room, for not mentioning by name all the multitudinous people who have been involved in this project since it first began. I usually say 1972, but probably the 1968 trial season by Peter Wade Martins and Barbara Green should be included. But you all know who you are, you're all fantastic, and all the others who are not here. I hope that we've actually mentioned most people in the introduction to the volume. I will just mention the institutions who supported this, which are mainly in Norfolk and in Cambridge, the Norfolk Archaeological Unit and its successor, Norfolk Landscape Archaeology, Norwich Castle Museum, and in Cambridge, the Department of Archaeology, the Institute for Archaeological Research, the MacDonald Institute, and also Cambridge Archaeological Unit, and Newnham College, which is where Sam and I are fellows. Right. Now, I'll just give you an exceedingly brief intro to the site, which most of you are probably already quite familiar with. It is in the middle of East Anglia, in the middle of England. And next slide. There we go. Brilliant. And over the 10 seasons that we excavated there, we uncovered about 2,500 cremations, which, as you can see from there are the red spots on this diagram, you can see does constitute pretty much the whole cemetery. I think we have good reason to assume that having excavated so much area outside the cemetery, including areas that appeared initially to have nothing in them, we're pretty confident that we have got the whole area. We haven't got all the burials. There were various episodes of accidental and deliberate urn digging, the earliest recorded back as far as 1711, and many disturbed sherds of pots were recovered. You can also see in this plan that we're sitting in amongst a whole complex of ditches, mostly earlier ditches, late Roman Iron Age enclosures, some of which may have some relationship to the cemetery. There is also, not so obviously visible, an extensive spread of prehistoric features, which were studied and written up by Francis Healy. And up in the top corner, you can see, how does this thing work? Oh dear. Anyway, well, let me see, go back to the slide, it's no good, too technical for me. Up in the top corner there, you can see some very obvious Grubenhäuser, and that's the edge of a settlement, most of which was probably ploughed away, and that part of the excavation was carried out by Andrew Rogerson in 1984. We have, as I've said, at least 2,500 cremations, so there were probably about 3,000 originally, and 57 inhumations, which are on the opposite corner, that corner, to the Grubenhäuser, the settlement. And here you see, indeed, Francis excavating, or contemplating, measuring some pots she's excavating, and what's described in the site archive as the golden hand of Brendan Murphy uncovering treasure. One of our more dense collections of urns. And the urns came in all sorts of conditions, beautifully complete or squashed flat. And from our points of view, the squashed flat one is as useful as the complete one, although more tedious to reassemble and draw, because it actually constitutes a complete artifact. One of the points we made early on was that the fragments, the burnt fragments of artifacts like glass vessels or bronze vessels or brooches and the smashed pots were the same, conveyed the same information in many ways as the complete object would have done. There used to be rather an emphasis, in fact perhaps there still is, on the finds from inhumations because they tend to be complete and recognisable and identifiable. And that led, in the past, to a neglect of the quantity of finds of similar quality, which were in fact being buried in cremations. And so you see plenty of distribution maps which have nice blank spaces for glass vessels, where actually we had, well, more than 100 identifiable and remains of many more. Okay, and what I was concerned about from the very start of the project, which I didn't initially direct, I must hastily point out, I only became director of it in 1975, and all these other people involved, like Peter and Robert. What I was, however, concerned about when I began studying it, which I did from 72, was that we should not just apply externally derived sequences and typologies. I certainly belong to that phase of thought that Chris was talking about, where I felt that there had been much too much stress on extracting typologies, often on very inadequately based data, and relating them too closely to perceived or debated historical sequences. And what I was concerned about was what I think archaeology is really about, which is the relationships between things in the ground, the evidence for events that took place in the past, and what that tells us about human behaviour and human society. And it is perfectly true that if you don't have some kind of chronological calibration, you don't know what is happening when, even if you've managed to identify what the relative relationship is. It is quite true that if you don't have any absolute sequence, you are left rather floating. So that was the reason why we did come back to this focus on chronology, trying to extract a sequence from the site, but using the evidence from the site as well as the other types of evidence, the typology, the seriation, any other kinds of information that can be thrown into it. And I think I'll just show you a couple more pictures and hand over to Sam, who will tell you about this in more detail. Urns in the ground together. I think at this point I hand over to Sam.
So what happened when Catherine came to talk to me about turning the final chronology from Spong into a project, a research project? There was an awful lot of data, and it needed to be somehow corralled and sorted through. And there are different elements to this data. There are the artefacts themselves. So one of the first tasks that we undertook was a complete resurvey and reclassification of all the artefacts from the cremations, and resorting them in effect, and deciding what belonged with what and how you could divide these things up. So the artifactual analysis was a major part. Catherine undertook the metalwork and the glass and the beads, and Ian Riddler undertook all the worked bone, and together those are really, really major contributions in themselves to the chronology, particularly of the 5th century, and a reworking and a looking at these types of artefacts in relation to all the continental chronologies that have now started to be published. So the artefacts in themselves was a huge task, and I have to admit, not one that I properly costed into the analysis. I think an awful lot of it was done in people's spare time. So the artefacts were one thing. The pots were another, and obviously at Spong Hill we do have a very long sequence of decorating pottery. There have been works such as J.L. Myers, decades ago, proposing chronologies for Anglo-Saxon pottery decorative styles, and that was certainly something that we wanted to test. And so one of the other tasks in the initial stages of this project was again to classify the pottery, and Suzanne Hackenbeck again did an absolutely astonishing job on this. It took her again far longer than we costed into the project for her, which I'm immensely grateful. It's sort of a complete coding by decorative elements, by height, dimensions of pottery, so a complete kind of reanalysis of the pots themselves. And those were the elements that we were then able to feed into the correspondence analysis. Now, when we started off on the project, I think we had a fairly kind of naive idea, really, that we would do kind of correspondence analysis and we would compare it to stratigraphy. But in the real world, things don't work in such a clean-cut way. And what we found we were doing was elements of correspondence analysis on both the pots and then the artifacts, and then a comparing of that to our stratigraphic information and a refining of the correspondence analysis. And we came up with, really subtle differences that turned out to be hugely chronologically important. So, for example, when you have, you see some pots up here, they're not quite the ones I'm talking about, but where you have chevrons, so lines on the shoulders of pots, where those chevrons have a line underneath them, they're a completely different phase from where they don't have a line underneath them. So both pot types have these shoulder chevrons, but depending on the other information that you're drawing in will completely alter where you then place those things. So a real refinement as we were going through. Now, we also had all this other information that can be fed into these models. Stratigraphic information, so examples of pot groups where these have to have been put into the ground at or around the same time. In sheer archaeological terms, these have to have been buried in a contemporary manner. And so we can use that information and feed it into both looking at the artifactual relationships and what's coming out through the correspondence analysis. We also have the stamp links that were identified in the original publications, and these are, pains to emphasise. These are done based on actual casts of the stamps, so it's not just a visual comparison; it's a physical comparison between them. So Catherine, in her original publications, had built up these series of stamp groups. You can then take that information on the assumption that a pot decorated with the same stamp, the same physical stamp, is presumably broadly contemporary. It doesn't have to be within the same year, but it's probably within the same phase. And again, you can feed that information in. So, and this is an example of one of those stamp group tables from the original publications. So what we ended up with was huge sequences of tables collating all this information together. And I think it is worth saying, I know Spong has taken a long time to publish, but it's really, really hard to do this kind of work if you're not a kind of statistical expert, which I'm not sure many of us are, but it would have been really, really hard to do this until the new version of Excel was released, because you physically need more than 110 columns to collate all this data together, and new Excel gives you that. So actually, until 2008, this would have been really, really tricky. So it was very timely that we did it at the time that we did. So we have, coming out from this project, some really significant findings. I mean, here's one of the most elaborate complexes here. So showing you the sorts of ranges of grave goods that could potentially be found in the grave together. And you've obviously got combs, you've got worked bone and antler items, you've got various types of decorative fittings, you've got brooches. And so those all have fed into our chronological schemes. And the brooches in particular have been hugely important. As we know from many of our East Anglian chronologies, worked bone is very difficult because in the inhumations it largely doesn't survive because of the soil preservation. But in cremation, because these bones tend to be items that are cremated, they do survive. And so we have a fantastic sequence now built up by Ian Riddler showing us the various chronologies. And here's an example of that. So this is Ian's worked bone comb chronology. And the thing I really want to draw to your attention is his dating of these work bone combs, and the major sequence of bone combs from Spong Hill belongs firmly in the 5th century and across the whole range of the 5th century, and that is of course again drawing on these continental chronologies that have now been coming out too. So this is a sequence that is firmly tied into the continental chronologies and doesn't make assumptions about when the chronology of an Anglo-Saxon item starts with relation to historical records. And we do all know that many of our chronologies do start in about 450 because of those historical assumptions. So those are something that we've just set aside for this project, and we're tying it into chronologies that exist from elsewhere and seeing how that works. The slide underneath is just an illustration of some of the correspondence analysis based on the grave goods. And I'm the person that did the correspondence analysis for the grave goods, and it was a real struggle actually, because there were a number of cremations where you had enough grave goods types alongside each other to tie them in, but it was a very, very hard thing to refine, and I'm not sure I would, go to the death over any of my sort of things. They work in a broad pattern, and they tie in pretty well to the pottery decoration and to the various stratigraphic relationships, but I think there could well still be more refining to do over the chronology of these items that we do find particularly in cremation graves. But the real conclusion, and the sort of, I think the really dramatic thing that came out of all this work, is the realisation that when we look at the graves that so both inhumations and cremations, so we incorporated the inhumations into our finds correspondence analysis as well to try and tie those two sequences together. When we map those inhumations, they sort of slot in with the later cremations. So you have a latest phase, which we have just called one phase, and I'm sure it's more than that. But there is one phase where you have cremation and inhumation being used at the same time and using the same sorts of grave goods actually. So you've lost the miniatures, you've lost quite a lot of the bone comb use, all those typically cremation finds that we think about, but you do have these cremations with brooches and with sleeve clasps and the things that would typically turn up in inhumations. So you can tie those two sequences in together very well. And when we map it against the far right-hand column, which is the Penham-Brugman phasing of those inhumations, all of our, what we are calling phase C inhumations, belong in the various phases of the East Anglian chronology, but they start in phase A1, FA1. So our latest inhumations at Spong Hill are the earliest inhumations within the East Anglian sequence. And the implications of this are that our phase A and B cremations are earlier. So where we have a phase FA1 probably starting in about 480 in East Anglia, in relation to that East Anglian chronology, we then have probably 2,000 plus cremations that predate that. And when you tie that into the worked bone sequences and the early brooch typologies that we've also been able to tie into the continental work, you do have a sequence here that is starting probably in the first quarter of the 5th century, which again is it makes sense in terms of the objects that we're finding, and it makes sense in terms of how that compares to the continental sites, but it does run contrary to what many people have assumed to be the case in 5th century Britain, and I think that's very, very exciting. We've also produced some nice pictures like this that show you the various changes in the pot sequence, and there are very, very distinct changes, and so I think both Catherine and I are now capable of looking at pots and saying that's early 5th century or that's phase C, which is a very, very useful thing to be able to do, so we can now tie these things in much better. And just to show you how the phasing works before Catherine takes back over, so this is now what we're seeing as phase A, which is starting somewhere in the first quarter of the 5th century, probably finishing around the middle of the 5th century. That's phase B, which actually looks pretty similar. And then this is that phase C, that very, very late, or it's actually not very late at all in the Anglo-Saxon sequence, but in our terms, this is very, very late. So both spatially and chronologically belonging with that sequence of inhumations that then starts. So I think that is the point at which I turn back over to Catherine.
Well, I will just whisk over a couple of these slides. This is the stamp-linked group, and that was also expanded further into style groups, particularly by Ken Penn, who's here, much of whose work underpinned the sorting of the pottery. Let's whisk through there. And yes, this should have come in earlier. The sort of way that you can see the stamp groups and the style groups cluster around the site. And in fact, this is relevant to thinking about the way that I interpreted the site when I first looked at it, and the differences between that and now. Because when I first tried to interpret the site in the 70s and the 80s, I looked particularly at these patterns where you can make sampling groups produce little clusters all around the edge of the site, and you can also produce another map which shows where the very earliest brooches are, and they tend to be in the middle of the site. And on the basis of that, I argued that we had a radial development of sort of core cemetery in the middle, and then this later development around the edge, and at some stage, still in the later phases, we have inhumations added. That's not so dramatically different, though it is a bit. And one of the things that has been obvious from the analysis that we've done recently is that radial development doesn't work. And of course, what I was doing was what was practical in those days, what Ken and I indeed both did, was to make distribution maps of the things that we already thought were interesting. And making those distribution maps by hand took quite a long time. Whereas now, with Sam's wonderful all-signal dancing database, you can press a button and there it is. So you could produce distribution maps of anything you wanted to your heart's content, which is something I had always wanted to do and never actually succeeded. So the difference lies in the fact that it appears that the whole cemetery has been in use pretty much from the beginning, but the idea that there are family grouped areas does still look very plausible, but in its latest phases it moves up to the edge there. And I think we should also have pointed out that you saw there the picture of the cremated bones. One of the other features which we've had that other cremation cemeteries before us did not was a detailed analysis of the cremated bone by Jackie McKinley. And that has been used by Sam in the recent analysis to develop, in fact, work that Julian Richards began some while ago too, to try and discover the social identity of the different kinds of material. So have we got particular individuals, age, sex in particular pots? And there are quite a few, mostly quite subtle variations, which you can see set out in great detail in the volume. The most simple and straightforward one is that you tend to get children in small pots, and they're quite often with sheep. And the animal bones were another great surprise, quite how many animal bones there were in our pots, and that included a large number of horses, which are, of course, a feature of Anglo-Saxon burials, but particularly usually elite Anglo-Saxon inhumation burials, whereas we had rather more of them than one might think of as being elite. Okay, I was whisked on. As Sam said, I looked at all the non-bone and antler artefacts again, and I also looked at them in the light of the immense amount of material that's been produced in recent years from similar cemeteries on the continent. And I think one of the things that we did was to get away from this 450 barrier, the idea that everything in England has to be after 450, and say, right, no, actually, this stuff is so similar to the early 5th century in the continent that it really must be looked at in that context as well. And I'm going to go extremely fast over my last couple of slides. Back to the inhumations, one of the surprises to me of my not yet complete reading of the new chronology volume was that they did in fact put two of our burials late. They put them quite late into the 6th century. And this is surprising and interesting and needs to be thought about more. It certainly confirms the idea that those two burials in the ring ditches there are late. So far from being the founder burials, as was once originally suggested, they could conceivably even be the very latest burials on the site, which isn't inconsistent with the sequence that you see in other Anglo-Saxon cemeteries, although usually a few generations later. But I have to say that it's true that this is moving into a methodological discussion that we may have later on. Given that, as you can see, the one, number 31, is within the ring ditch, which you can see cutting the ring ditch that's around 40, the fact that they come out in the wrong direction in the seriation is puzzling. It's something we noticed, as a matter of fact, when we published the thing back in the 80s, that it depends on the typology of the shield bosses, and now also of the spears, because Karen Holland-Nielsen has amazingly done the typology of spears. And it's perfectly true that the shield boss and the spear from 31, which is this one, do appear early to everybody, and certainly in the new sequence, than those that come out of that one. However, if you look at these two graves, you can see that 40 was intact when we found it, and you can see the collapsed lid of the chamber there as we uncovered it before we excavated it. So we have a complete assemblage in there. We have most notably the sword with the scabbard, which I had put quite early, but others may disagree with me, and the later shield boss. So I thought an early and a late object, something up for discussion. Also spear, buckle, bucket. Over here, as you can see, we did not find that. This grave has been robbed. And you can just about see, I think, the bottom of the hole, the enormous great pit that was dug through this grave. And this was a targeted robbing because if you would, well, you probably can't remember the plan, this is off-centre. There are two graves inside that ring ditch, and they targeted that one very precisely and exactly. And they took nearly everything out of it. They did not take the shield boss with very nice shield case, fisher case, because it was stuck in that bottom corner there, leaning up against the chamber. They didn't take the spear, either because they didn't want it, or because and threw it out, or because it was already lying up there. And so, to me, it seems perfectly reasonable that we here have graves which are pretty abnormal for Norfolk, even if you might think they were bog standard in Kent, and therefore they're extremely likely to have an unusual range of artefacts, some old things and some new things. So I would reckon that this one has got an old shield, a distinctive shield with the fish, and we really don't know what else was in it. And it makes it even more surprising because it makes that one the latest one, which might be why it was robbed, and it makes it perhaps even later. So there is more work to be done in thinking more about how the inhumations at Spong Hill articulate with the new versions of chronology which we're about to hear presented. And I think that will throw out more interesting ideas. But I just want to stress what Chris has already said, that we've constantly got to go back to the ground in archaeology. We do need to look at what was actually going on when we actually dug it up, and what we actually know about how things were related to each other in the ground. However fantastic and clever the analyses that we can do afterwards, we do have to start from that, and that's what we were trying to do in Spong Hill. And there are a great many other things I would say in the conclusions, but they're in the book, and I think I've got that as my time.
Very much. We now have 10 minutes or so for questions. So can I invite questions from the audience? Or comments? I'll explain this at the back right there.
I'll explain this. I like how you talk about correspondence analysis. You have all sorts of wonderful constraining prior information for correspondence analysis. You know, you can say that this pot must be the same date as that pot, and they must go together. From the stamps, from the closed groups. So did you use that in the correspondence analysis? Did you use constrained correspondence analysis, or was it just bog standard?
It was just bog standard. Because, I mean, the idea at the start of the project was to compare the two methods. And we did end up blending them, because we did end up sort of taking the results of the correspondence analysis and then taking it to stratigraphy and adjusting where we were phasing things accordingly. But we wanted to keep, we kept the correspondence analysis as a sort of pure pot or a pure grave good analysis.
Right, so you basically did two separate analyses and validated one against the other.
Yes.
Rather than
Yes. So, I mean, there was a different way of doing it, but that was the route that we chose.
Well, I mean, I think this is the next sort of frontier in correspondence analysis, isn't it? Is the constraints.
So we took things like the correspondence analysis phases assigned to the pots, and then looked at, in great detail at how that worked in terms of how they were buried in the ground and how they were associated with each other. We tested everything against everything else in a quite sort of long and detailed way. But from our point of view, not being, well, in my case, a correspondence analysis expert, it seemed to us much more straightforward to see what we could do with one method and what we could do with another method, and then put them together and see how they correspond with each other.
Not least having English heritage on your back, so draw this analysis to conclusion and publish as well.
Where is it? Where is it? Where is it?
Diana, did you have a question?
Yes, Diana Briscoe. I seem to recall that at one point you said you were going to release the database. Is this actually the case?
So I'm going to put it, so Cambridge University has something called DSpace, which is an online repository which they promise to maintain in perpetuity. And I think Cambridge they probably will. So yes, as soon as I've cleared that pile of applications from
Jackie.
Jackie McKinley. I wanted to ask a specific question for May about the groups, the big groups. Now, the reason I'm particularly interested here is because cremation burials of this period, this early period, are very different to cremation burials of any other period that with the mortuary rite was practiced, and later Anglo-Saxon cremation burials, in that there is very little, if any, pyre debris, which suggests that the pyres aren't the same place. And of course, cremation and burial are completely separate parts of the rite. So, obviously, that means that vessels can stay above ground quite a long time before they're buried, which is why I'm interested in the groups. Now, I do appreciate that it looks like they all went into the ground at the same time, but that doesn't mean to say they were cremated. Did you see any differences? I mean, the pyre goods, it's the difference between the pyre goods, for instance, which would be burnt on the pyre with the person, and what you were finding to do with the vessels and the vessel groups. Was there anything there to suggest there may have been differences in time, or would it be too small for you to see that?
There is the odd instance where you have a burial group and one of the pots looks substantially older, as if it has either been dug up from somewhere else and reused, or it's been kept around for a long time. So one of the interesting things about the spatial analysis I did is that people, males, females, infants particularly, are buried in appropriate pots for them. So as Julia Richards said all along, men are in bigger pots, women in slightly smaller pots. Infants are in tiny, tiny pots.
This is actually something you find across the whole period, the whole use of the mortuary rite, actually.
But there is this odd, there is the odd occasion where you're looking at a group and you're thinking, well, that doesn't look right. But it's definitely contemporary in archaeological terms. It's sort of, either our phasing of that whole time is wrong, but that time is then confirmed by its belonging to another group where it does look right. So there is the odd instance where it does look like a longer pot has been used as part of another group.
But they're very rare. I mean, one of the results of cross-checking the correspondence analysis failings to the burial groups was that actually the majority of the burial groups worked okay. And a whole bunch that I thought were wrong when I went back, it turned out they were sequential burials. So that was fine. They were top of the earlier ones. But there were a few that stuck out, as Sam says.
Was there anything out of kilter between the pyre goods and the pottery at all? Was that all in kilter?
No, I don't think so. I think it all hung together in general terms. I never had the feeling, Jackie, that they had been sitting with Elmham before they buried them. It could be. I mean, it's just conceivable that they...
It depends how long you keep them as well. It could be 5 years, it could be 6 months. I still got my dad, and he's been there for 2 years now, so...
I think the other thing to emphasise is that we're only using 3 phases.
Yes.
Because that was all we really felt confident. I mean, we're using 3 phases and we have A stroke B because we weren't quite sure which one went where. So it's actually quite a crude phasing. But it's a relatively short-lived site, so I didn't really want to refine any more. There may be the potential to do this in combination with Alex's.
It would be intriguing.
Yeah. I say we are going to do some data, so more sophisticated people will be able to have a go with it and see what they can do with it too.
This is something that we will hear from John, that actually in these sequences, generally speaking, old items included in later assemblage stand out really quite clearly. We have time for maybe 1 or 2 more questions or observations.
There was a whole tranche of conclusions that I didn't say anything about at all, which is about what this tells you about what happened in the 5th century. And the conclusion was that it's even more regional than we thought it was, and that what's going on in Norfolk and Lincolnshire around there is not necessarily at all the same as what's going on in the rest of the country. So that all of our characters fought themselves down there, and either by virtue of being new people or by influencing the people who were there already, they make things look very different up there from the way that they seem to look in the rest of the country for another few generations.
So B was right and so was Forster. I think you gave a